ladies and gentlemen, and welcome, warm welcome to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. My name's Jocelyn Bell-Burnell. I'm the current president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and it's a very great pleasure to have you here and to introduce tonight's event. This evening's discussion is part of a series of public events that Royal Society of Edinburgh, together with the Centre on Constitutional Change and UK in a Changing Europe, are holding. Royal Society of Edinburgh is also publishing position papers covering a variety of issues aimed at enlightening the European debate, such as examining the implications for the UK of a leave or remain decision, considering the key issues including fiscal matters and trade, freedom of movement, social Europe, the environment. But we're not advocating, as the Royal Society of Edinburgh, either for leaving or remaining. Our aim is to provide independent and objective analysis of issues that all of you, of course, will wish to consider in very great depth before you have to vote. This evening we're discussing the economics of the choice, a pivotal issue on which the outcome of the vote will doubtless be determined. There'll be a summary of tonight's report written up and made available on the website as soon as possible. And we're going to hear this evening from Professor Anton Muscatelli, Professor Ronald MacDonald, and Professor Charles Nolan, who will give us presentations and answer questions about the issues. I'm also pleased that this evening we have Peter Jones to chair. Peter, as you probably know, is a freelance business and economics journalist writing for The Economist and The Times. He's previously staff journalist on The Economist, covering Scotland and the north of England, and Scottish political editor of The Scotsman. He's co-authored 2 books, The Road to Home Rule with Christopher Harvey, and Scottish Independence, a Practical Guide with Joe Merkels and Michael Keating, a study of the law and economics of Scottish independence. He's written academic papers for the David Hume Institute, Edinburgh University, and for Scottish Affairs. He also makes occasional contributions to radio and TV programmes and has spoken at numerous conferences in Britain and abroad. So we're very fortunate to have Peter Jones this evening to introduce our speakers and guide us through the rest of this evening. Can I hand over to you, Peter? Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you. This evening we're going to concentrate on the economics of the EU Brexit debate. It's a good example, I think, of East-West cooperation in that the Royal Society of Edinburgh has invited 2 distinguished economists from Glasgow to discuss this. Hopefully the outcome of this evening will be a bit more seemly than the last East-West encounter on Saturday in Hampden Park, and that you will not choose to storm the platform. Anyway, Professor MacDonald is slightly late getting here because of transport arrangements he had to meet. So we're going to start with Professor Anton Muscatelli, who you will know as the distinguished principal of Glasgow University. He's what, along with Professor MacDonald indeed, is that rare breed of academic who is also what the Australians call a public intellectual, in that he is not afraid to lend his expertise into the sphere of public debate to greater inform it. You will have noticed during the discussions on the arrangements for greater tax powers of the Scottish Parliament, the fiscal framework discussions, and Anton Muscatelli was a noted contributor to that discussion, and indeed the outcome of it is substantially formed by some of the things which he set out. And previously he was involved in advising the Kalman Group, and the expert report that he produced, chaired out of there, still bears reading for some of the issues regarding fiscal devolution, many of which are still not resolved. But anyway, this evening he's going to talk about the wider economic implications of Brexit or not. The brief was, for both speakers, was to try and set out the issues in as impartial a way as possible. But issues, this they have done in the two papers, which are available outside if you haven't already read them. Issues have to be tested against evidence, and it's evident, I think, from some of the things which are said in the papers, that the evidence may well have led him in one particular direction off the fence. However, that we can explore a little bit further in the debate and discussion. In the meantime, Anton, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that very kind introduction. As you say, in the interest of full disclosure, as you'll know later, and though some of you already realise, I do have a particular view in this debate. But what I've tried to do in this piece, which is co-written with, jointly authored with my colleague Charles Nolan, who's here with us, who will be here to answer questions as well, is to try and give a bird's eye view of a number of the issues which cover the debate around Remain or Leave, around Brexit. And it isn't, it's actually quite a complex debate, partly because of the number of variables which are involved, economic variables involved in discussing both sides of the proposition. One of the difficulties, as we say at the very start of the paper, is that you have to begin to imagine what the alternative is to staying in the EU. And of course, there isn't a single model, which actually complicates the picture even more, because what is the alternative? Is it an EEA type model like Norway? Is it a Swiss model? Is it a WTO, standalone model? Is it a special deal? And without that knowledge, it sometimes makes the whole discussion much more complicated. Nevertheless, we've tried to cover all the essential trade-offs. There are a number of areas where there are clear trade-offs between the two positions, and that's what we've tried to do in this paper. So let me start with, there are 6 of these, and let me start with the UK's financial contribution to the EU, which is often one of these figures you'll see bandied about in the press. It's around how much do we contribute to the EU budget. And it's, at the moment, the net contribution is between 8.2 and 9 billion, depending on which year you look at. There's actually quite a nice chart in which we reference in here to a House of Commons library publication, which projects that forward a few years. Now, the difficulty with this is well, first of all, let's say that is not a huge sum. It sounds like a huge sum, but actually in the context of total UK government spending, it's actually quite small. It's 9 billion or 8.2 to 9 billion out of a total of 700 billion. So that gives you a feel for the size of it. So the trade-offs around here are obvious. If we didn't belong to the EU, we could spend that money on other things that we would have a higher priority for instance, the NHS or whatever. And that's the argument that the Leave campaign will generally make. On the other hand, as the Remain camp points out, it depends what model you might enter into, because, of course, many of the alternative arrangements, such as the ones entered into by Norway or Switzerland, also involve making a contribution to that budget. So, for instance, Norway, on a per capita basis, contributes about 17% less than the UK, but it still contributes 17%. So if we went in a Norwegian-type deal, we wouldn't be spending 9 billion or 8.2 to 9 billion into that budget. We'd probably be contributing about 2 billion. So it makes the sum even smaller. So you can begin to see how these issues arise. One point we don't make in the paper, but actually you can find out from information, is that different parts of the UK benefit more or less from that, depending on whether they receive European social funds or regional development funds. And actually, Wales and Northern Ireland do rather well out of that. So you end up, they are net probably gainers from being in the EU. Scotland is probably actually break even, and it's England the one who contributes more to that particular equation. The second area which we analyse in terms of trade-offs is the EU influence on taxation in the UK. Now, being part of the EU does actually impose some constraints, for instance, in the structure of tariffs that we have vis-à-vis the rest of the world. So by joining the EU, you have to adopt the common external tariff, which means that if we wanted to protect our industries more or less, we're not able to do that. We have to do that in conjunction with our partners in the EU. The other area where there are some constraints, as we point out in the paper, is around VAT. In the sense that VAT is part of the tax architecture of the EU, and we couldn't unilaterally say that we wanted to abandon VAT for a different form of taxation. In reality, even if we left, however, it's unlikely that we would want to abandon VAT, since actually it's quite a common form of indirect taxation. So you've got to be very careful around, again, when you talk about the Leave and Remain campaign, what would the world look like if we actually left? The one area where perhaps there might be more dispute going forward is the extent to which, in areas like financial transaction taxes, where the UK and a number of other countries are opposing the Commission, which is supported by a number of EU members, including France and Germany, where you could find within the EU some disputes around a number of areas of taxation in future, where we would need to fight our corner and fight our case. And this might again form some argument for the Leave campaigners, where the Remain campaigners, of course, would argue that it's unlikely that a tax regime would be imposed on us, which is against our interests. The key area is clearly trade, and and I know Ronnie's going to speak about trade, so I don't want to go into too much of that, but I think it's probably the most important economic question bearing on the decision as to whether to leave or remain in the EU. It was the initial raison d'etre for the European coal and steel community with the Treaty of Paris, and indeed the Treaty of Rome setting up the European Economic Community in 1957. Although both of those treaties talked about an ever closer, well, the latter talked about an ever closer union, it was based on common economic interests. And it's really interesting to go back to some of those preambles, actually, if you have the time to go and look at the Treaty of Rome and the Treaty of Paris to see exactly what motivated people originally. One of the things that's quite interesting, I'll show you a graph. I mean, obviously, the UK was quite keen to get into the European Economic Community and didn't succeed in doing so until the early 70s, partly because of opposition from some of the existing members and some of the issues around negotiation. One big argument between the Leave and Remain campaign is what has it done to the UK's economic performance? Now, the UK actually, immediately after the Second World War, actually had a GDP per capita which was probably about a third larger than the EU6 average, the 6 original members of the European Economic Community. However, by 1973, our GDP per capita declined to only being around 10% larger. So you remember some of the debates around the UK being the sick man of Europe, slow productivity growth, and actually it coincides with a period of post-war of once the war had finished and you remove the dislocation of the war years, you see a decline in the UK's export as a percentage of GDP. After we joined the EEC, you see a recovery in that. And actually our growth rate, our growth performance is greater also post-1973 on average. So the Remain campaign will say, well, here's evidence of trade driving growth, and had we not joined the EEC, this would have been actually a real difficulty for Britain as the sick man of Europe. Of course, the Leave campaign will say that this is actually quite a difficult counterfactual to prove one way or the other, because how can you go back and allow for all the variables that were active at the time? But what there isn't any doubt whatsoever, and neither side would deny, is that the EU is the biggest trade partner to the UK. About 45% of our trade in goods in goods. Interestingly, that figure is the direct trade with the rest of the EU. If you were to include also trade with other countries which have a deal with the EU, like Turkey or South Africa, that figure goes up to 63%. Remember, if we leave, we would need to renegotiate some of these trade deals potentially. However, as the Leave campaign has pointed out, we also run a trade deficit vis-à-vis the EU. And the feeling is that if we were to leave, we could renegotiate a trade deal which would be advantageous to us. And a lot of the debate is hinging around that point as to what sort of deal we would have. However, the Remain campaign would argue not everybody in the EU runs a trade surplus vis-à-vis the UK. Germany does, certainly. France does. But actually, it's a small proportion of their total trade. Secondly, a number of countries run a deficit vis-à-vis the UK, and they might be less pleased about entering a separate trade deal. So again, you can see how the trade-offs hinge around that point. And it's really difficult, as I say, to analyze the counterfactual, because it's difficult to know what the alternative would be if we were to leave. And of course, as I say, there are different regimes that we could enter. We could have a Norway-type regime. Interestingly, if we entered a Norway or Swiss-type regime, it's likely that there might be some wrinkles in that. One of the points we make in this particular paper is that because Norway has chosen to stay outside, I think, the common fisheries policy, imports of smoked salmon actually are subject to taxation into the EU, 13%. So there are some interesting wrinkles there that you have to take account of. A lot of the debate around this really hinges on whether you believe that trade can be switched quickly between Europe and other markets. So those who argue for leave, like Patrick Minford and a number of other economists, are saying, actually, in reality, we could just redirect our exports elsewhere if we wanted to. And by the way, if we lowered some of the tariffs, imports would become cheaper as well. The Remain side would say, actually, geography matters. You can't just start trading with the other side of the world. Geographically, we're close to Europe. And we know from gravity models of trade that these things do matter. Moving on to the fourth item very quickly, because I realize I am running out of time. I was going to just finally show you one thing around trade, which is important, because one thing that's interesting is tariffs are not the only costs. Transport costs, non-tariff barriers are also very important, and this should form part of the debate. We were discussing before we came in, and actually there's very little discussion around non-tariff barriers around services, for instance. But if you look at the last 15 years, there's been about a 15% decline in our trade costs between Britain and the EU, whilst trade costs vis-à-vis the rest of the OECD and the emerging economies have hardly changed. So, if anything, we are being drawn closer to the EU in terms of patterns of trade. But let me now move on to the last couple of items. Migration, labour markets and employment. I have to say that from most of the evidence doesn't show some of the concerns around the impacts of immigration into the UK on wages. I think most of the analysis that's been done on that suggests that there's very little impact. If anything, we know that the skills we've imported into this country from the EU and indeed the EEA countries have added to our productivity. So the argument there for the Leave campaign has to hinge around other costs that have been imposed on us. And of course, they would point to things like pressure on the health service, pressure on schools, etc. I think the impact here is clearly differential depending on which part of the UK you're in, and that's obvious for some of the debates we've seen. But I have to say, those who argue even that immigration has had a negative impact on unskilled wages neglect the fact that the UK, of course, has a minimum wage. Indeed, many parts of the UK, many companies pay the living wage. And if you have a floor like that to wages, it's unlikely that unskilled immigration is likely to impact negatively on that. Fifth area of which is particular, and one last point on migration. Of course, if we do a trade deal a la Switzerland or Norway, we would have to accept free migration anyway. And the Remain camp would argue certainly that it's unlikely we would be allowed any sort of free trade deal within if we leave without that level of free level of labour mobility. The fifth area we analyse is around the city and financial regulation. And this is a really interesting area because, of course, London is such a hugely important financial centre and such an important hub for the UK economy. And the question is, would the UK's exit impact on that? And the Remain camp would argue absolutely that a number of US and indeed even Swiss financial institutions are based in London because membership of the EU gives them passporting rights. One important area is non-tariff barriers. The EU has eliminated a lot of these non-tariff barriers. Is it possible, for instance, that if we leave, some of those might come up again and home bias might develop, so that if many of our financial institutions and many of our service companies might have to start moving to Germany, to Frankfurt, to Amsterdam, to Luxembourg, to Paris, in order to do their business. Of course, the Leave side would argue that remaining within the EU is likely to imply greater financial regulation, and therefore actually leaving gives us more freedom to develop our financial services. And finally, the subject of the Treasury paper that was published today, which is around the short-term macroeconomics, because all the things I've talked about are all about long-term trends, long and medium-term trends. But is there also a short-run effect? And the short-run effect is around macroeconomics. It's what will happen to business confidence, to consumer confidence, as a result of us leaving. And there are two scenarios, not surprisingly, around here. One is that, and the view from the Remain side is that business confidence could be dented. Consumers will be concerned about what might happen to growth in future. They'll rein back. And on the back of all of that, you'll find demand falling and a recession will emerge. And that's the thrust of the Treasury paper that was published today, that the UK could experience a year-long recession. On the other hand, the Leave side would argue that it's not going to be quite as serious as that. There's going to be a negotiation that will last perhaps 2 years. Nothing will happen right away. That will give exporters time to reorient their trade. It will also give new opportunities in terms of developing new markets. Businesses will become more competitive as we can reduce regulation. Big debate around regulation. Is this something we would want to do or not? And so these are the two sort of broad scenarios that emerge. In conclusion, it's really complicated, as I said, to pull all these assessments together. The Treasury has attempted to do that in terms of a long-term and a short-term assessment. The Leave side would argue that these don't take into account the positive impact that regulation and reorientation of trade could have. But I hope that our paper gives you a feel for the different areas in which the debate is taking place. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. For our second speaker tonight, we're also fortunate to have another distinguished public intellectual in Professor Ronald MacDonald, who is an international expert in matters of currency and international finance, and has advised and consulted more august bodies than there's probably time to name in this brief introduction. He's also played a considerable part in domestic debate in Scotland, having written extensively about various models of devolution and tax autonomy as it relates to devolution, and most recently in the independence debate on the question of a currency for an independent Scotland. However, tonight he's going to turn his attention to questions of trade and how trade might be affected by a Brexit vote. Professor MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Peter. As Peter mentioned, my main area of expertise is in international finance rather than trade. However, the kind of work that I've done in the finance area has been, as Peter mentioned, largely in matters of currency, and particularly looking at longer-term trends in real exchange rates and trying to determine what are equilibrium exchange rates. And it turns out there's a very close interface between trade theory and international finance, at least the kind of international finance that I do. So I'd like to think that I'm pretty up to speed with where trade models have been going over the last 20, 30 years. Now, what I'm trying to do in this paper is present, I think that's from the previous study, yeah, here we are. Basically, what I'm trying to do in this paper is take some very standard trade models to try and, if you like, give people a toolkit as to, you know, what's the correct decision with respect to Brexit. I mean, Anton's very carefully mentioned both sides. There's been lots and lots of numbers thrown about by various bodies. And so the tack I decided to take was to, okay, I'm going to look at some numbers, obviously, but to try and go through various trade models, describe them in a very simple way. What do they predict? What do they say about where we are with trade in Europe? Do they have predictions for what trade might be like outside Europe? Now, I think it's important to state up front, well, why is trade important? Trade's important because of the so-called gains from trade. And I think of this in either a static way or a dynamic way. In the kind of earlier simple trade models, which I'll briefly mention, they're concerned with static trade. And essentially what they're about is comparing an autarkic economy, an economy with no trade, and then an economy which is open to trade. And what most of these models show is that the gains from trade come from the country in question that enters trade being able to consume a much larger bundle of goods than it would in the autarkic state. That's the basic point. Or it would have a larger GDP, to put it slightly differently. Dynamic gains of trade usually come from the more recent trade models, and they're about really economic growth. Does trade stimulate economic growth? Now, of course, the big issue with respect to trade in the EU is the existence of the single market. This is a very powerful market in the sense that it eliminates, as Anton was saying, tariffs, non-tariffs, quotas. It also tries to harmonize product standards across countries, so we're trading in a uniform platform, if you like. But it also does away with the narrower border costs, what I call the narrower border costs. That's the cost of clearing customs and the associated bureaucracy with that. Now, these can be very important, actually, in trade, which we'll see later. So all of the kind of different layers of the single market can be described as the elimination of border costs, essentially, in a broader sense. And as we'll see, these border costs tend to be very important. So the question that really we're addressing tonight, is the single market superior in terms of the gains from trade relative to some alternative model, be it a model such as the Norwegian model or the Swiss model, or even, as I've seen recently, the Albanian model, which I find most fascinating, I think, yeah. Okay, so some basic trade statistics here, some of which are more important than others. As everyone knows, I think the UK is a small open economy. It's got a very high trade to GDP ratio of around 60%. That's very, very high, and you'd expect, therefore, trade to be an important motivator of both productivity growth and GDP growth. That compares with bigger economies such as the US, which is a much more closed economy with around 20% of trade, and the EU itself, of course, is a relatively closed economy with about 20% of external trade. Therefore, trade matters to the UK. There's also a close link between what we say about trade and investment, particularly FDI. I don't have time to cover that either here or in my short paper, but that is also an important issue. And it turns out a lot of the arguments that are here equally apply to particularly foreign direct investment. Now, in ballpark figures, 51% of total UK trade is with Europe. The UK imports predominantly from the EU, around 53%, and exports mainly to non-EU countries, although the proportion we export to the Euro area, or the EU rather, is close to 50%. It was about 48%. Now, a point I'm pretty keen to emphasize, a general point here is, which has, I think, been pretty generally overlooked in the current debate, is that if you look at trade, international trade today, we're not thinking about trade in final products. We are thinking about that, of course, but the majority of trade today is intra-industry trade. It's trade in intermediate products. Now, I think that has a very important implication, as we'll see later, for whether you believe Britain should stay in or leave the EU. So how do we explain that level of trade? I've put here the UK's top 10 trading partners. The top is Germany by a clear margin. Second, the US. Then we have the Netherlands. That might seem a little surprising, but it's important to note, which I note in the paper, that there's the so-called Rotterdam effect, that Rotterdam being the largest port in Europe, a lot of goods come into Europe which are not necessarily produced in Europe and end up being denominated as Dutch goods or being sourced from the Netherlands. We then have China, we then have some other EU countries as well. So Germany, the dominant country there. But here we have, a bit difficult to see, I should have chosen other colors, but here we have trade, the trade position, surplus or deficit. So to the left, you've got a trade deficit, and to the right, you've got a trade surplus. So massive trade surplus with Germany and some of the other EU countries. Smaller trade surpluses, I can't actually see. One of them is Ireland and Spain, yeah. So, as I think Anton mentioned, often proponents of Brexit point to the large trade deficit with Germany as indicating that maybe in the UK's interest to leave and cut a deal with the EU. Then again, if you think of the goods that Germany exports, my view is that they're probably not that price sensitive. So Germany could continue to sell us these goods with tariffs, and probably our demand for these goods wouldn't change very much. But in all likelihood, our horrendous current account position would worsen considerably. Now, another important point to make is that there is an important distinction between trade in goods and trade in services. I think it's true to say that, and I think Anton alluded to this, that the EU has been very good at eliminating trade costs in goods. It's only been partially good at eliminating costs in services. Financial services, yes, but other kinds of services not quite so good at eliminating transactions costs, such as professional services. There are still important barriers there, which I'll come back to that point later. But it's interesting to note that the UK runs a trade surplus in nearly every category of services except for tourism. And the UK's largest surplus is actually with the United States, not with the euro area, although we have some euro area countries which are close runners after the US. Services are dominant in terms of our external position. That, I think, is a problem in terms of our current account deficit, but that is another direction, I think. I've got some figures here which Anton, I think, also mentioned. Obviously, the financial sector is a very important employer in the UK, both in London and also north of the border, where approximately 85,000 people are employed in that sector. And it's also a very important contributor to gross value added. Okay. And so I'm given the time constraints. I won't go through these in any details. They are in the paper, so people can follow these up. So that's the point I made there about there is this distinction between trade in goods and trade in services. Now, it's interesting to note that the EU is trying to address the issue of the frictions in services. This is not a particularly EU phenomenon. If you look at trade worldwide, there tends to be a home bias in terms of services. You find this even in countries outside the EU. So it's not a particularly EU-specific phenomenon, but I think it's important to note that the EU is trying to address this in terms of the 2006 Services Directive and also their 2015 Single Market Strategy. Now, I'll give some numbers that the Treasury have come up with for these two directives and the effect that they believe that will have on Britain's economic performance. Okay, so we've given some numbers there. I want now to move to what trade theory has to say about why countries trade. Coming from Glasgow University and also being at the Royal Society, one obviously has to start with Adam Smith. In his Wealth of Nations, you can always find a quote in Adam Smith for just about everything in economics. And in the paper, I have the quote where he clearly articulates the gains from trade that accrue from what are now referred to as absolute advantage. That is, if a country is more productive in the production of a good, if it's more competitive, if you like, relative to its trading partners, then it should focus its resources on that good. It should redirect resources to that good, and by so doing, it can enjoy a greater bundle of goods. It can have a higher GDP than it would if it remained closed to trade. Now, one of the greatest insights, I think, in trade theory was not made by Smith, but David Ricardo, who posed the question, well, what if one country has an absolute advantage in all goods? And there would be some examples of that. In his day, the example was that of Portugal. He says it's still beneficial to trade if one country is relatively more productive in the production of at least one good. So this brings in the concept of comparative advantage and relative productivity. So the key driver of the gains from trade in the Ricardian view is relative productivity. So relative productivity here drives trade, the advantages from trade, and that in turn could lead to economic growth. Now, it's important to note that these models start from a position where trade is closed, where there's no trade, and then you open it and you get these productivity advantages. As we'll see in more recent theories, it's openness per se that drives relative productivity and economic growth. One other general point to make here is that the goods entering trade in these earlier classical models are very different. You'll be aware that today the goods we observe in trade are very similar, so they're not obviously very good at explaining that. There's also purely a focus on the production side in these models. Now, the only formal test I've seen of the Ricardian model is the only formal test I've seen which is supportive of the Ricardian model is, very interestingly, for the EU area. It's a study by Altzinger and Damijan, 2009. There have been lots of studies since Ricardo wrote his seminal piece on trade. The only studies that people refer to as supportive of his model are those by Donald McDougall, which were conducted in the 1950s, 60s. These studies were undermined, perhaps most significantly by two ex-colleagues of mine at Strathclyde University, who showed that the Ricardian model had no predictive powers for most country pairings. That was back in the early 70s. But this study convincingly shows that comparative advantage is important within the EU area, and there must be a reason for that. Is it the single market? You certainly don't find evidence of these comparative advantage effects outside the single market. So I think that's worth mentioning in passing. Another model, which I'll just briefly mention, is in the historical development of trade models, is the Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model. This is a model which focuses on capital endowments. So if you're relatively rich in capital relative to labor, you'll have a comparative advantage in exporting capital-intensive products. Now, when the theory was set up in the 50s and 60s, early 60s, the US was the most capital-intensive country in the world, and when people tested the model, it failed miserably. So there's little empirical support for this model. Personally, I think it probably has some purchase when you're comparing developed countries with less developed countries, but it's probably not going to be very useful in an EU context, because capital endowments, labor endowments are probably very similar, at least for the original 12 countries. There may be a different story for the accession countries, or the recent accession countries. So these models all focus on the supply side. The Ricardian model, as I say, seems to have limited support, but with the failure of the Heckscher-Ohlin model to be supported empirically, Linder suggested we move from thinking about purely production side to the demand side. Now, the demand side was picked up in a big way by, I think, the most significant development in trade theory in recent times, And this is the theory that geography matters. Okay, geography matters in determining a country's trade. Particularly, the closeness you are to a large market determines the kind of firms you have, it determines the kind of productivity of these firms, and it determines how much you trade. Now, this new trade theory is synonymous with the works of Paul Krugman and Elhanan Helpman. This was the main reason Krugman got his Nobel Prize for the development of the new trade theory model. Basically, in this model, preferences are very important. Consumers want to consume an almost infinite range. The modelers set it up as an infinite range of goods, many of which are close substitutes for each other. So we're talking about closely differentiated goods rather than the very different types of goods that are in the more traditional trade models. And you're also talking about monopolistically competitive companies. Large markets generate monopolistically competitive companies rather than the perfectly competitive companies that are in the traditional models. Now, this matters because these monopolistically competitive companies can reap increasing returns to scale. Now, that's a very simple concept. It simply means if you double the inputs into the production process, you get a more than proportionate hit on output. So output increases more than proportionally. You get big productivity gains, and that feeds through to a big hit on economic growth as well. Now, what the whole thing boils down to is that these companies tend to cluster or concentrate geographically, or they agglomerate. And interestingly, Smith was very aware of the agglomeration phenomenon as well, and Krugman actually cites him in his work as being an important part of the thought process which led to the new trade theory model. And there's a kind of hysteresis effect here that once a company opens, or once a group of companies opens in a particular area, they tend to attract skilled workers. They often have externalities which attract other firms which may be producing other goods into the same area. So you get these network effects and externalities which further enhance the role of the cluster or the agglomerate. Now, I refer to these as kind of superclusters. They're we have clusters in Scotland. We've got the gaming industry, for example, in Dundee. But the kind of clusters here we're thinking about are clusters where you've got particular concentrations of one industry plus other industries alongside, and they all have these external benefits feeding off each other. Now, I'm not very good at drawing anything in PowerPoint or Word, and that's especially so since I don't have a research assistant at the moment. So the way I think about these agglomerations and the importance in the context of the European debate is in terms of a Venn diagram, which you're going to have to visualize yourself. So the Venn diagram is one in which we have a circle, quite a large circle, going right up to Scotland, emanating from London in the southeast. A similar circle, which overlaps that circle centred in Paris, say, or the Greater Paris region, and another circle based in the Ruhr, which again overlaps all these guys. Now, the important point about this is that these circles are interacting, and this is another prediction of the new trade model, that supply chains are crucially important once you get the build-up of these clusters and agglomerations. So you've got supply chains, we're thinking here of distribution, and all the services connected with distribution, which now account for about a third of the final price of a product, or the final value of a product. And as I've shown in some work with a colleague, Luca Ricci, these effects are very important for developed countries in explaining productivity differences across countries. Now, the existence of a protected market obviously facilitates the creation of such agglomerations in Europe. And often people refer to the standard infant industry story, which was so important in Japan in the immediate post-war period. And it's important to note that not only are these supply chains where basically you're thinking about intermediate goods being traded across countries and within countries, you're also talking about the need for free labor movements between these different agglomerations. And in the financial services sector, certainly, about 10% of those employed in the EU come from outside outside of the UK, but from within the EU. So there is that comparison about migration and the existence of these clusters. They do depend on these interdependencies in labour and in terms of goods. Now, not content with the new trade theory, the new trade theory pushes the whole thing a little further. This kind of modelling is extremely technical, but it boils down to basically going back to the kind of Ricardian view that relative productivity matters and competitiveness matters. But what this whole new trade theory is about is bringing quite a lot of industrial economics to bear on trade theory, and basically says that the more competition you have between economies, basically the lower productivity firms within industries go out of business. Companies that were protected by barriers prior to entering a single market area, say, and they are replaced with high volume, high productivity firms. So you get these inter-industry reallocations, which are driven here by a different form of comparative advantage. But nonetheless, these kind of models predict that the average productivity of a country will be increased if you drop tariff barriers and the other border costs associated with having a border. So these NNTT models clearly support the existence of a single market, but I suppose if you were to take that to its logical conclusion, it would seem all barriers to trade are bad in that model, so that may be an argument for further reducing barriers. However, as I note here, such a unified world market is unlikely to be a realistic alternative to EU membership, and there's also the practicalities in terms of negotiating new trading relationships. And that I've illustrated in another diagram, which again is not completely illegible. It is in the paper, but basically the kind of orange area is the only area which is not covered by any form of EU preferential trade agreement. So that's about 15%. Everything else is covered by some form of EU preferential trade agreement or is currently under negotiation with the EU. So you're clearly talking about a big ask if you want to withdraw from the EU and renegotiate all these alternative trade agreements. Obviously, a lot of uncertainty would come into that. Now, I think one of the most important, how am I doing for time? Okay. Too many slides as usual, yeah. Okay, so one theme I'd really like to emphasize, which Anton again touched on, is the so-called gravity model. This is a model which is really an empirical model, and all of the trade models that I've mentioned can be seen in the context of this gravity model, but more specifically, the new trade theory models are directly related to this. Basically, the gravity model says that distance is important. The further you are away from your markets, the higher transactions costs and transportation costs are going to be, and the more frictions you have between markets, the less likely you are to trade. There's also an argument about economic size, but I wouldn't mention that here. The key thing is the transactions costs and the barriers that are introduced by being far away from other trading centres. Now, there's a huge amount of evidence suggesting this is crucially important. The first, and this was a big hitter paper by McCallum in 1995, he showed that the elimination of the border effects that I started with, that is all the layers that the single market does away with, not just the narrow borders of customs and bureaucracy, etc., but all of these border effects. He showed that this is between the United States and Canada, but it's been replicated for just about every country on the planet, that once you do away with these things, trade would be 20 times higher. As always, there was a lot of debate around this number because it was so controversial. A lot of people said, well, he didn't do this correctly, blah, blah, blah. But even when you tie this down with really precise statistical methods, you still get a very large border effect. So 6 to 12 times you're going to trade 6 to 12 times more if you do away with these borders. And this has been replicated by a large number of studies. There's a large number of studies which have looked at this for EU trade. I picked out one here. Carrere, for example, finds that intra-EU trade has increased by 104% over the period 62 to 96. That's about 3% per annum. The recent Treasury paper also confirms that trade is increased by 68 to 85% compared to a baseline of WTO membership. Okay, some more stuff there. So I'll wind up now. So why do countries trade? Well, they want the gains from trade. They want the static gains, bigger bundle. They want the dynamic gains, economic growth. Is the single market the best way of maximizing that relative to some other model or some other country experiences? In thinking about that, as I mentioned, we have to note that most trade today is intra-industry trade. How do we explain that? As I noted, in terms of the overall statistics, the majority of the UK's trade is with the EU, although overall that represents a deficit. It's important to note the distinction between trade in goods and trades in services. As I noted, the UK runs a trade surplus across nearly all of its services, and many of these are, in fact, outside the EU. There are these directives from the EU which are intended to decrease the internal frictions on services, particularly non-financial services. The Treasury, in its long-run paper that Anton referred to, gave some calculations for these. The 2006 directive, they reckon that has increased UK GDP by approximately 1%, but the latter directive could add a further 4% to GDP over a 15-year period. That is bound up with some other reforms relating to e-commerce and a single energy market, but that would have a huge hit on both GDP per person, £2,800 better off just from these reforms in themselves, and they also have the interesting conclusion that the public sector revenue generated would evenly offset any UK payment to the EU. The models that I mentioned, the Ricardian model is a lot of intuitive appeal, and it seems to have some empirical support for the EU, but not for extra EU trade. The gravity model suggests that borders matter, they really matter. If you eliminate these borders, then you get big gains from trade and presumably big gains in productivity. And therefore, a big question in the referendum debate must be whether the UK on its own could renegotiate free trade areas to do away with these barriers, and would that be feasible? How long would it take? How much uncertainty would that generate? If you could do all that, then perhaps you would get to a place which would be very similar to what the EU offers now. I mentioned in my paper alternative models of Norway and Switzerland, and I'm happy to discuss these further during the discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much indeed. If you can join a seat on the platform, Anton will as well. We're also going to be joined by Charles Nolan, another distinguished professor of economics from Glasgow, and co-writer of the paper with Anton Muscatelli. Charles has the advantage of having worked for 8 years at the Bank of England and seen the effects of policy-making decisions and how they actually work out in practice. So as this is a major policy decision we're discussing tonight, his experience is particularly important. I'm going to limit discussion here to the pros and cons of the actual vote on June 23rd, which is now just a month away. I don't really want to get into possible implications of what might happen after that vote if there are, the circumstance much discussed here in Scotland, that Scotland votes for staying in, but the rest of the UK, or indeed the whole of the UK, votes out. That's a different argument, and there's a whole load of different issues apply there, and I've no doubt that the Royal Society would explore them in great depth if that circumstance comes about. But that's at least a stage away, so I want to concentrate on the immediate issue of the pros and cons of the Brexit vote. And I want to, we've got an hour or so, just under an hour for discussion, debate, questions, etc. I want to kick that off by asking our panelists that when the question of the vote is raised, particularly amongst pro-Brexiteers, I find that the argument that they most often revert to is that it's all about sovereignty. And sovereignty is more important than all this economic detail. That, it's about regaining sovereignty that Britain has lost to the EU, and once Britain has regained this sovereignty, Britain will be able to do all sorts of things which the EU is currently preventing us from doing, and therefore will be more prosperous as a result. Is this an argument that has any validity in a modern world where sovereignty is limited by interconnectedness and interconnectivity of a whole lot of economic issues? Ronald, can you?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly coming from the trade perspective, as I said, geography is important. We are where we are geographically, and that is important for our trade, for our economic well-being. So, yes, you might gain some sovereignty by leaving the EU, but what would you be giving up if you were doing that? I think that's the key thing. And as you rightly say, we live in a globalized world. It's not clear to me that there would be huge gains in sovereignty relative to what you'd be giving up in terms of where your geographical position is in the world. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think it's an interesting part of the debate. I do think, as I point out in a piece, I think that came out today, that you have to distinguish between sovereignty and power. And are people really interested in sovereignty, or are they interested in the power that we can exercise through these interconnections? I think one of the interesting things around this economic debate, and I think this is the point I was trying to make, is that you need to look at what the alternative is. It's pointless saying that we're going to have this sovereignty and then we're going to enter a trade deal in which we abandon it altogether, say a la Switzerland or Norway, because that doesn't tend to sort of carry much conviction. You have those advantages already. Why would you, and you have seen the quote from the, I think, Norwegian foreign minister that said, if you want to know what it's like to be in the EU but have no say in its determinations, try the Norwegian model, which is basically what we have at the moment, except we would have no say. So this is where it gets, I think, really, really quite complicated. I think sovereignty is an interesting issue, but you need to also at the same time talk about influence and power and how we would be able to determine trade deals, labour mobility, etc. within that context, new context.
Yeah. Charles?
Yeah, I've not really got much to add to that. I think that's exactly right. It's the difference between authority and power. So you could take back all the sovereignty and you would have the authority to negotiate free trade deals with whoever is out there, but whether you have the power to do that is the issue.
Right.
The only other very big point I would say is that by leaving now, we give up the option value of leaving in the future, which is so you could well have a view that it's an awful institution, the European Union, but the alternative is even worse, and so it's better to hang on in there for a bit until that cost-benefit calculus goes the other way, and then you. I'm just being mischievous with the option value.
Enjoyed that, no? All right. Questions from the floor. Chap in the centre here. There are microphones, and if you could perhaps tell us who you are as well.
Hello, Neil Mitchison. I was the European Commission representative in Scotland for some years. My question is about this inter-industry trade figure, which I find very interesting because, I mean, there's particularly Mr. MacDonald, but to all of you, if that figure is right, then what you're saying is something which reached the customer has on average crossed borders 3 times. So any border costs are now 3 times as big as they were in Adam Smith or maybe even Ricardo's model. Is that right, or have I misunderstood?
I'm not sure about the 3 times, but it's certainly, yes, the significance is considerable, and that is why people like McCallum and everyone who's followed on looking at that gravity type of setup finds these huge costs from borders, massive costs from borders. And the interlinkages in trade between the different clusters I mentioned in Europe is something that's brought in much more detail in the Treasury paper, for example, where they look at the pharmaceutical trade that goes on at inter-industry level, aeronautics, for example. All of these are crucially important. So erecting borders is going to prohibit the very trade that these clusters depend upon. And one of the questions I put in the paper is, well, would that Venn diagram still exist if we left the EU? Particularly, okay, I think given the size of the market in the southeast of England, you're still going to have an agglomeration there, but is it going to be as efficient? Is it going to be as productive as it would be if you still had the cross-border trade at 0 transactions cost, basically? Yeah.
I think an important point about this inter-industry trade is that it's not really visible in a way which a lot of trade is.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
for example, we have a large pharmaceutical industry which exports, I think, more than 3 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
But that goes to industries in France and Switzerland, which either then get traded onwards or sold to the consumer.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's why I made the point that when we think about international trade, we often think about the final products. We don't realise there's all that going on underneath the production of these final products. Yeah. So it's not just the tariffs and quotas and restrictions on the final products, it's the restrictions on all these other things in between.
Right. Okay. At the side here.
Hello, Muir Dickey of the Financial Times. A couple of questions for Professor Muscatelli, if I might. First one, you mentioned that there's little evidence that immigration has impact on the salaries, even of unskilled labourers, because of minimum wages. Does that mean that it has an impact on employment, whether people are employed at all? Is there any evidence that suggests, as many people imagine, that the jobs are taken by Poles or Romanians or whatever? And also you mentioned that Scotland is roughly sort of net break-even when it comes to its contribution to the EU. Could you give us a sense of what's different about Scotland from England, Northern Ireland and Wales? Thank you.
I mean, in answer to your first point, I don't think there's any evidence that the minimum wage has really impacted on employment hugely in the UK. So the point being that it's likely that what is happening here is that it's the institution of the minimum wage has had various effects. One of them is possibly to actually probably increase productivity at that lower level. And we know that from efficiency wage and other type models. It actually is very difficult to find in immigration studies. I mean, I used to do quite a bit of work on migration in the 1990s, and the only evidence that I've ever seen which showed that there was an impact on unskilled labour through cross-border migration was around US data looking at migrations from Mexico. But actually, that was a very short-term lived effect. So what you have is a very dynamic model. You have initially an impact, and then over time you find skills development, etc., causes this to actually change productivity, the sort of dynamic gains that Ronnie was talking about. The point about those figures I cited actually come from the House of Commons Library survey which tries to decompose the UK contributions by region. The reason you get differential effect is because where European social funds and European regional development funds are spent are not uniform across the UK. So if you take the contribution of 8.2 to 9 billion and you distribute that equally across the UK, or in proportion to taxpayer base, and then you try to overlap on that where the income from the EU comes, then you get those differential effects. And I think, I'm trying to remember the figure, but I think in the case of Scotland, it was literally break even. It was in the order of, was it literally a handful of pounds per person was the net contribution, whilst in England it was much more.
Yeah, and I think in Scotland we receive proportionately more by way of agricultural subsidies and also in terms of structural funds.
That's right. It's ESF and ERDF funds, and to some extent agriculture, although most of it is ESF and ERDF.
Right, okay. But just to go back to your first point, I thought I'd read certain studies which suggested that we have a large amount of seasonal labour which comes in the sort of fruit and vegetable picking areas and fish processing, for example, which some studies had suggested had tended to depress wages at an overall level.
The ones I've seen suggest that the net benefit is positive. But I mean, again, you've got to ask your question: why is there such migration? It's unlikely that it's to do with competition around wages. It's more than likely that this reflects excess demand for jobs that domestic workers don't want to do, and that's very similar to what you see in the southwest of the United States. When you've seen some of those figures, you find that generally it's flows of employment, and there's very little impact because what it's doing, it's reflecting excess demand effects across borders.
Right, and given that you run a large national institution which attracts talent on a global basis, is there an advantage to being in the EU in terms of attracting the best talent to Glasgow University?
Well, absolutely, which is why, I mean, some of you may have seen the agenda piece I wrote for the Herald last week. I mean, roughly 20% of our research-only staff come from non-UK EU countries. And actually, it's interesting, some of them have actually brought their funding with them. 50% of our European Research Council grant holders in Glasgow have actually come to Glasgow with a grant, having won that grant in another EU country. So they have actually come with funding, which, in 12 to 13% of our total research funding comes from the EU, which again shows you the importance of it. Hence, one of the reasons why, obviously, I have a particular interest in the debate beyond being an economist.
Right. Thanks very much.
Hands up.
All right. At this point, can I ask the audience, just for a show of hands, of those, firstly, who are on balance inclined to vote to remain on June 23rd? Could you show your hands? Okay. And those who are inclined to vote leave? Right, okay. And could I ask you to, considering what you've heard, lady behind, considering what you've heard, if there's something you'd want to put to the panel which you feel they haven't addressed in this debate? Or any of the other? I'm not an economist, but I would say that... Sorry, no, just bring a microphone. Bring the microphone, sorry, to the lady here.
I'm not an economist, but and obviously you're preaching to the converted, but there were a few words up there that Professor MacDonald in his presentation, and they were, I think, 3 words. Deficit, I thought it was. Deficit. I forget what the other 2 were, but the British trade with the EU was in deficit. Well, to me, I think that means it's not in profit. Am I correct?
Well, a deficit, I think, is a different concept to profit.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound good to me, in spite of everything that you were saying.
Well, the UK has an overall current account deficit of 7%, and that, I think, is a very important issue that has to be addressed. But that isn't purely an EU phenomenon, essentially. It's a much wider phenomenon than simply our trade with the EU. We do have a deficit with EU countries such as Germany and an overall deficit, but we have to set against that some of the advantages in terms of financial services, for example, which are a very important component of employment in the UK. But the deficit issue, I think, has to be put into a wider macroeconomic perspective, and that is something which, dare I say it, the government is not focusing on at the moment. So it's not particularly a European issue, the deficit situation. It is a macroeconomic, it's a worldwide issue that we have to address. And how we address it is, I think, an important issue. One way is to look at what's been happening to the pound, for example, over the recent past, and what economic policy has been doing with respect to that. But one can't blame the EU for our current account deficit.
Right. I think the lay person might think that, well, if we're selling less to the rest of the world than we're buying, then we're not trading at a profit, and eventually, if we keep on doing that, we're going to be bust. Perhaps the answer to that is to withdraw from this trade area and to introduce protectionist barriers so that our own industry can flourish again, and we start selling more to the rest of the world. Does that work?
I don't think so. I mean, we already, by being part of the EU, we already have the advantages of trading with the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So we have this single market which eliminates these costs, and we're still able to trade with the rest of the world. To address the problem of our, if you like, our global current account deficit, we have to look at the sectoral imbalances in the UK economy. So at the moment, we still have a debt overhang from the financial crisis. The government is attempting to run a fiscal surplus, whereas the company sector is also trying to run a fiscal. It's also trying to run a surplus. So these things don't add up in terms of our external balance of payments, basically. Right. So all I'm saying is that, I can see why someone would say we've got this terrible current account position, but leaving the EU and putting up tariff barrier is going to make that worse, essentially. Because if you think of a lot of the goods we import as being relatively price sensitive, which is one of the arguments I made for staying in the EU with respect to Germany, then if we leave and Germany puts tariffs on all these goods and other restrictions, then they're going to be more expensive. Our current account position is going to get worse, actually, not improve. So that doesn't make sense. So the issue of the current account position has got to be addressed elsewhere. And my own view is that we have got to return to a strategy which puts more emphasis on manufacturing, particularly probably light engineering products where there are productivity gains. But that is a question of our economic and industrial strategy, I think, rather than being a member of the EU.
Right. Of course, one of the ways you can deal with a deficit is by issuing debt and various other instruments of which you have some experience, Charles. Can you shed more light on this question?
Well, I think there's nothing wrong with trade deficits as such. We do have a trade deficit with Europe overall. We have a deficit in goods, and then we have a surplus in services. That's how these things work. And when you have a deficit on your trade, you borrow and then you pay it back. And when it gets very big and you're borrowing a lot from abroad, then potentially there's an issue. But if you have your own currency, it's less of an issue. And we're in the EU, but we have the pound, so it's not such a big deal. I wanted to comment something that came up earlier, if I may. So in the debate at the moment, there's been a lot of criticism, Project Fear. How could we trade if we were outside the EU? And the way the treasuries work and other analyses have been spun, it is almost like a threat. Look how difficult, how awful it would be if we try and make these treaties on our own. there's a much more positive way to tell that story. It's to look at what Europe has actually achieved. So what is the single market? When you strip it all back, what is the single market? Well, it's a market that's removed all tariffs. So the average tariff in the world just now is about 10%. The EU has, for intra-EU trade, it's removed all of that. It's created a customs union, which means you can trade across borders without being stopped and having to have proof of origin, documentation reviewed, and so on and so forth. That's a big cost. That can go from anything between 4% to the OECD even had a figure of 25% of the cost of the goods being traded. The EU's done away with that. The single market's done away with that. It creates a level playing field in all sorts of areas to do with services and qualifications. You know, if you get qualified in one country, you're a doctor, a vet, an architect, lawyer, those qualifications travel more or less. And many other, so it's always, you say, well, all these regulations they're standardized for a reason, because it makes all the other trade frictionless. So that's what the single market actually does. And of course, now, the other thing is that as part of the EU single market, the EU, of course, negotiates trade deals. Well, there's 50 trade deals, free trade agreements with other trading blocs currently in play at the moment, and 67 further ones under negotiation. So if these all come off, I think something like over 80% of UK exports will be to markets with trade agreements with the EU. I think there's a very positive case can be made for the European Union and the single market, actually. And it is true that if you unwind that and try and say, we'll come out and then we'll try and negotiate something similar, that is well, if you're an international lawyer, you'll be employed for the next 30 years. And it's a great job to be in. But apart from that, I think, I don't think the transition costs in coming out to go back into these deals, it just seems absolutely enormous. I hope I'm not giving away my position on this too much.
Yeah, if I could just come back, just some further cogitating on this issue. The UK current account deficit, 7% of GDP, is a very serious issue. I mean, for some time we've been relying on capital inflows, obviously, to finance that. If we were to leave the EU, we have to ask what would the effect of that be on these capital inflows. My argument would be that in all likelihood we'd see a sudden stop of finance into this country. I think that is the experience of other countries where you're going into a position which is extremely uncertain. Charles's point, and as I made in my presentation, all the renegotiations you would have to make in terms of trade negotiations. If you have a sudden stop in finance to finance the current account deficit, what would happen? The exchange rate would go through the floor. Alarm bells would be ringing at the Bank of England about what that would mean for inflation. What would that mean for interest rates? Interest rates would, in all probability, have to rise, I would think, quite steeply from where they are at the moment to finance the deficit, because people ain't going to give you money if you're in a period of great uncertainty, and that would presumably stall any recovery that we're seeing in the economy at the moment. So, I think it's a dead story. Yes, we have some trade deficits with Europe, but to use that as an argument for withdrawing, I believe would be shooting ourselves in the foot. Yeah.
Okay, Anton, do you want to add?
No, I think Ronnie's covered it really well. I mean, I think this is where a lot of the short-term costs that the Treasury has identified come from. If you have a trade deficit, you've got to finance it. That basically means that there's excess, more people in goods market are trying to sell the pound than they're trying to buy the pound. So you need some balancing flow, and that is a capital inflow. And that capital inflow can only come from people who are wanting to invest, who are wanting to buy UK financial instruments, UK government debt, UK corporate debt. If that goes, the pound goes through the floor. And that it depends what you think will happen the day after a Brexit vote. Will Germans, French, Americans continue to buy UK corporate assets or UK government assets or not?
Okay. Yeah, you want to come back, sir, gentleman at the side here.
Thank you. Ewan Sutherland. Charles Nolan gave a very interesting account of the single market. But I want to pick up something which Anton Muscatelli said earlier, which is the single market is great in many areas, but in services it's very patchy. Some things happen in telecommunications, some things happen in broadcasting, some things happen in banking and financial services. Now, in banking and financial services, we seem to be reliant on a passporting system. It's far from clear to me that anybody has ever managed to get something that looks like passport out of a trade agreement. Now, if I've read the numbers correctly, 12% of PAYE comes off the back of financial services. Now, some of that must be domestic, but some of that clearly is foreign. So is the risk then that after the 2 years, if you lose the passport, a significant number of jobs then choose to relocate or gradually seep away? Is that correct, really?
I think that's correct. I think that's one of the most serious, and Ronnie outlined just how many jobs are dependent on that. I think, again, you've seen statements from some financial and non-UK financial institutions who currently are based in London to service the EU, just exactly what they might do if there is a Brexit. And I can tell you one thing, I was reading, as you probably many of you know, I wasn't born here, I was born in Italy. Another reason why perhaps I'm biased in all of this debate. But I was reading Corriere della Sera, which had Francesco Giavazzi, who's an economist who's well known to some of us, and he was saying, we should get ourselves ready in Milan for a possible Brexit because this could be a fantastic opportunity for us all. Now, that article hasn't actually made it into English yet, I don't think, but actually it tells you just what others are beginning to say. This could be a fantastic opportunity, and they'll be saying the same in Frankfurt or Paris or elsewhere.
Okay, right. Chap at the side here, and then the lady in the middle. Just come along.
Sorry for missing much of the talks. I just flew in from Chicago, but felt it important to get here. My question is about the role of science and innovation in relation to the economics of the choice, in particular the extent to which the UK and Scotland in particular depends on or wishes to depend on EU funding for science. So again, this is perhaps stretching a little beyond the economics question, actually bringing in another aspect. But I'm interested in this global competition that we have to attract academic and entrepreneurial talent, the extent to which this decision will affect that choice, and also if you have ambitions to grow or maintain mutually beneficial collaborations, to what extent does this choice impact either way?
Right, okay, well I think Anton is principal of Glasgow University, which has ambitions to grow its science base quite markedly, is best placed to answer that.
I mean, I think all international collaboration is hugely helpful to science and innovation. We know from a variety of reports, Royal Society in London and others have shown just how much more impactful collaborative research is, which is why, building any sorts of barriers is bad in science. And by definition, whatever happens after the 23rd of June, disrupting the EU's network in terms of scientific and innovation, research and innovation would be very bad. I mean, I'll give you some real examples of the sort of things which we receive funding from the EU in Glasgow. Malaria funding is on research against malaria. A lot of that involves complex networks across Europe because it's a complex problem, involves multifaceted solutions, involves hundreds of institutions. A lot of that collaboration is funded by the EU. We've received in the last few years in Glasgow, as I say, about 12 to 13% of our funding from EU institutions, both through FP7 and through the European, through Horizon 2020, including the European Research Council. Other research in areas like cancer research, some of the gravitational waves research that recently, Glasgow participated in, this huge announcement. Of course, that's beyond Europe. It's a global research network, but a lot of that research, some of that research within the European partners was funded by the EU as well. And you could go on and on and list further projects. So it's hugely important. I mean, of course, people will say, well, you can replace all that through agreements. It's like trade agreements, you need to negotiate that. And it's not secure. If you take Switzerland's situation, mean, Switzerland had a referendum on reducing mobility. The first impact on that is that Europe said, well, you're suspended from the Erasmus Plus network, and by the way, your participation in Horizon 2020 will be on a, essentially possibly only for 2 years, and then we'll need to look. I suppose you have to ask your question, would the Leave campaign, those who campaign for Leave, those who campaign for Brexit, want to maintain full labour mobility within the EU, between Britain and the EU if we leave? Because if we do, then, of course, like Norway and Switzerland, potentially we can sign up to European research networks and Horizon 2020. But the whole point, the whole argument that's being made for leaving is we contribute too much to the EU budget, and by the way, we don't want as much EEA labour mobility. Well, that's a sine qua non for maintaining a single research area. So the reality is we'd be giving up all of that, and it would place the UK at a massive, massive disadvantage in terms of world science and world research.
Well, if I can just play devil's advocate for a moment, you mentioned Switzerland, and Switzerland, the vote Switzerland made, and Switzerland kind of slightly semi-detached nature with the EU, doesn't detract at all from the importance of the research centre at Chern and its ability to attract really the world's best talent to that. And if your university is as good as you say, I mean, people will come regardless of what grants and so on might be available from the EU.
First of all, CERN is not a Swiss facility. It's an international facility. It just happens to be located on the border between France and Switzerland. So it's particularly different. Now, devil's advocate would say, well, look, Swiss universities are still great. Well, first of all, they have so far participated within. It's just recently that the threat has come from being cut off. Secondly, they invest a huge amount within their universities. The question is, of that 9 billion which we would no longer pay into the EU, would all of that be invested? I mean, the Swiss have invested a huge amount, and a lot of it has been directed to bringing talent in. So Switzerland's got an interesting relationship with labour mobility. There are big debates about labour mobility in Switzerland, but as far as skilled migration is concerned, they've always prioritised it. If I think of all the 20% of my research-only staff, those who are already here would not be affected by a leave vote, let's be absolutely clear. But given that there's turnover, the fact that you would be putting newcomers through a Tier 2 or indeed for EU students a Tier 4 visa procedure, if you know a bit about how the UK manages that in a wonderfully bureaucratic fashion, which makes some of Brussels regulations pale into significance, you realise that how difficult it would be to attract some of that talent.
Okay. And hand raised, lady just too long.
Myrtle Pont. I'd like to ask each member of the panel which arm of the media you would have some faith in representing the views that you've given tonight.
The media.
Well, I'll go for good old newsprint. I would go for The Economist and the Financial Times. He's now left, so I can say that freely.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, they're not neutral. I mean, certainly The Economist isn't neutral. The FT maintains a more equidistant position, although they're not neutral either. But I certainly would trust the FT and The Economist more than many others.
Okay, Charles?
Yeah, I would go with that.
All right, a consensus there. 2 rows behind.
Thank you, John Brand. One of the arguments that we hear from the Brexiteers is that when we leave the EU, we'll be free to pursue the dynamic markets of China and Southeast Asia, etc. As far as I'm aware, membership of the EU hasn't inhibited Germany and France from selling much more to these countries than we do anyway. But is there any way in which we would benefit in that area by leaving the EU?
Well, at the moment we trade. I mean, this kind of links in with the gravity model, where size matters as well as the geography. So the bigger the mass, the bigger the country, the more likely you are to trade with it. But it turns out that in terms of China's mass, we're a very small proportion of trade with them relative to our trade with, say, an equal mass in terms of the EU, which is much, much higher. So I don't really see there be any advantages outside the EU. You presumably lose a lot of the trade with the EU if these border costs are introduced. And it's an open question as to whether you would improve your trade with China. I mean, the distance is important there. You would have increased transactions costs, obviously, just in terms of the actual trading distance. And also you've got the issue of preferences of the goods the bundle of goods that we consume. Could you replicate these by substituting more goods from China? I doubt that very much either. So I think not is my answer. Yeah.
And we don't have a trade deal with China at the moment, and neither does the EU.
No.
I think. I mean, one is in the works, as far as I understand it. Do you think that we in Britain could negotiate a better deal with China than as leaving it to the EU and being part of an EU deal?
It was a good question. I honestly can't answer, but what I would say is that I certainly wouldn't pin my hopes on leaving the EU to gain a better trade deal with China to replace what we'd be giving up by leaving the EU. But I think, frankly, in all of the trade deals which are still ongoing with the EU, I think it's probably better to have the heft of the EU behind you in negotiations rather than negotiating on your own.
I suppose you could argue that from a Chinese perspective, it would be preferable to do a deal with a market of 500 million than one of about 65 million.
I would have thought so, yeah. Plus you're getting a much bigger range of goods than you would get by just doing a deal with one, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Right. Do you have a different perspective? No, having asked the question?
It's an argument that I've heard that what's the basis that could be for it. It's reassuring that there isn't.
Can I give a different angle on that, but it follows directly from that, because there are, I mean, there are different types of Brexit advocates, and there's those who are arguing, as you say, for completely free trade and don't believe in the sort of gravity model that Ronnie was talking about, instead believe you could quite costlessly redirect your trade to Asia and faster growing markets. In order for that to work, and this is, I suppose, one of the things I find quite irritating in the Brexit argument, is the feeling that you can cover all bases. You can do that, and then you can do other things. In order to do that, you would need to really become a very, very open, free market, low regulation economy. That involves cutting regulation, including in areas where, yes, some of it has been built up in the EU, but we probably choose to maintain some of that around health and safety regulation, around product safety regulation. We'd need to probably review all that. The size of a welfare state. There are different views in the UK about different aspects of the welfare state, and it's interesting to look at the social attitude survey, but we spend a lot on areas like health, which tends to be not very trade friendly because it ties up a lot of resource. And so there are really interesting issues here. One of the problems I see with the whole Brexit debate is that it's Brexiteers, and it's a point I made in an article that I brought out today, Brexiteers look at 5 or 6 dimensions, 5 or 6 different variables: trade, mobility, public spending, and they assume that they can all be configured in a different configuration. But if you go for that sort of world, I want to direct all my trade to China, I want to be a really free market, open economy, you may not be able to determine the size of your welfare state. You may actually not be able to take that 9 billion that you get back from the EU and spend it on health. You may actually have to reduce some of your welfare spending in order to have a very flexible wage, lean economy. Indeed, you may not be able to even to control your your immigration, because ultimately you can't afford to shut your borders to high-skill migrants. So paradoxically, the sort of Patrick Minford type Brexit model might actually be one where, yes, if we even get close to achieving that, it will come at the expense of some of the other variables that other Brexiteers emphasise. So it's this rather odd coalition between different perspectives that I find quite irritating at times.
Yeah, I think that Patrick Minford gets his 4% boost to GDP by assuming that all of the 10 billion or so is spent on an income tax cut,
yes,
rather than in subsidising farming. Neil, do you have something to add to this question about trade deals?
I'd like to make a small factual point, if I may, which is not often observed in this argument, which is that if you look at all these agreements that we have at the moment between the EU and, say, South Korea, they define a whole lot of things, but there's lots of things which aren't defined and are subject to a committee with representative of the EU and representative of South Korea coming together. Presumably, in the event of Brexit, that would continue until such time as Britain manages to negotiate a new agreement with South Korea, so we will be subject to Brussels regulation even more in these very free trade agreements without any representation there. And it seems to me that if we're afraid of Brussels, what Brussels is doing to us, shouldn't we be even more afraid of what Brussels should be doing to a Brexit with those free trade agreements after we left?
Yeah, all right. Lady down here, yes, you've been waiting very patiently. Tell us who you are.
Anne Packard. This is a question for Charles Nolan. You referred to the issue of transition costs, but one of the things that has long kind of concerned me is the transition time period, because it seems to me that the time period of very real, dramatic uncertainty may actually turn out to be rather longer than people might think. And I wonder if you have any view on that timing issue, because it seems to me it could almost drag on for a decade before the economy might reach the position it's in now.
Yes.
Charles?
Yes. So, yes, I think that's right. So there's initial, once Article 50 of the treaty is activated, there's a 2-year window where we start to unpick the basics of the relationship. And then there's in effect, the renegotiation then starts as to how you start stitching it back together again, or what kind of deal you do. So when Anton and I were reviewing this literature, it didn't make the final cut. But I think the consensus amongst legal experts is that it would take at least a decade to start putting things back together again. Just looking at, and that's fairly basic stuff. So most of the trade deals that we see done cover, trade deals are very good at covering trade in goods. They're not very good at covering trade in services. And so even relatively simple trade deals like the one with Canada has taken, 7 years and counting? And that's a relatively straightforward trade deal, because there's a bit of Ricardian trade deal. You know, the Canadians make different stuff to us in Europe, so the actual deal is relatively straightforward. But even that's taken 7 years. The number of trade deals we would be trying to replicate if we left is much more complicated. So to me, 10 years sounds like optimistic, to be honest. So during that time, I think legally what happens, we would default to WTO trading rules. So Europe would almost immediately stop representing us, and we would revert to WTO rules. Patrick Minford would withdraw entirely and just say no tariffs in the UK at all. And we would deal with other countries on the basis of the tariffs that they would decide to impose on us. So we wouldn't have the most favoured nation access to markets that we would have if we were a part of the WTO.
Right. So do you want to follow up?
So if you take that time span of a decade and the pound's dropped through the floor and nobody's investing in the United Kingdom, are we up the proverbial creek without a proverbial paddle?
Well, these are very difficult areas to get into. It is very difficult to forecast what would happen. I mean, the world almost certainly wouldn't end. But just how it would unfold is very difficult to. So even at the moment, you know, what are the clouds on the horizon? Well, we've got the advanced economies have still not recovered from the financial crisis that's now 5, 6, 7 years ago. China's wobbling, developing economies are facing difficulties. UK still got 3 or 4 more years of austerity to go. The The cuts to government expenditure haven't ended. They're still penciled in for 4 or 5 more years. So government's going to be a net drag on aggregate demand. Banks and financial firms have still not met all their capital requirements, so the next 3 or 4 years are going to be periods where the bigger banks in particular are going to have to build their capital. So all these things, it doesn't mean the world's going to end, but these are very real threats on the horizon that the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the Bank of England, they're all looking at these issues that we're facing, as I've just said, you know, economies that have still not recovered, banks, China, and what voting to leave the EU would do for Britain would be to put a trade shock, an uncertainty shock on top of all that stuff. And it's just impossible to know how all that would play out. It could be that China bounces back. It could be that banks suddenly become very profitable and their capital bases, you know, recover wonderfully. Developing economies solidify, capital flows calm down. And it could be that, you know, we can vote to leave and not a lot changes, but I doubt it. These are very big overlapping risks, I think.
If I could ask a typically stupid journalistic question. The UK, as part of the EU, is signatory to all these deals, which are sort of EU deals with other countries. If there was a Brexit vote, why can't we just simply cut and paste all these deals and say, right, this was the EU South Korea deal, now it's the UK South Korea deal, and it's identical in every respect. Nothing has changed. Why would that take 10 years to do? Why can't we do that?
Well, I suspect we'd have to start from scratch, and I don't see why any country would accept the same deal that we had with the EU. It's a quite... Well, we wouldn't have the negotiating powers of the EU behind us. That's for one thing. That's a much more heft, I think, much more.
You have to remember that South Korea is a good example, actually. So South Korea, if it extended the same, now I don't know the details of the South, but the games that would be played would be something like the following: Europe would presumably be a bit ticked off if we left, and so. With these third-party trade deals, the third party would be potentially ticking off a block of now 450 million to keep the block with 50 million sweet. I don't think the calculus will play out like that. I don't think you can just if that were the case, we would have the world would be covered with free trade deals if you could just do it.
Yes. Well, on the other hand, you were just outlining, you know, how the world economy is a bit delicate, and if this was cutting and pasting was a way of reducing yet more uncertainty and bringing back a degree of certainty, wouldn't there be a perceived advantage in that?
I suspect the details of these trade deals are so complex where lots of give and take, you know, maybe South Korea gives a bit because of interest in Germany and gives a bit less because of interest in the UK. It just doesn't hold that you can salami slice it like that. I would find it implausible that you could unpick deals like that.
But I think the bigger argument is even if you could do that with all these countries, you're not going to be able to do it with the EU. You're no longer a member of the single market, so the border effects, both the broader border effects and the narrow border effects come up, and you have all of the statistical information that we have as to what that's going to do for our trade. And that is going to create huge uncertainty. And I would go back to the point about the elephant in the room, which is our current account deficit. It's massive. It's 7% of GDP. And I very firmly believe, as the lady was saying about the prolonged transition period to the new state, I would go further than Charles. I would say that in all likelihood we would have a sudden stop of capital into this country, and if we did, you know, the pain could go on for a generation almost. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So you're being very patient.
Russell had a wee bit to do with organising this, and it was about making sure that people got some measure of the questions on both sides that both campaigners had to answer. So could I ask the panel, I hear people like Lord David Owen and others saying that staying in is bad news, there are things that could go wrong. Could they just talk a little bit about what might go wrong if we did stay in, bending EU out of shape because of protecting the euro being one of the examples, but there must be a lot deeper and bigger things than that, just to put the good arguments you've put on the Brexit side in a little bit of a context.
I mean, if I could have a go, I mean, I think the things that could go wrong if we stay in, and it's probably around the sort of discussions that Ronnie outlined around the deepening of the market in services. You know, it's going in the right direction. We're supposing it stalls because of greater protectionism within the EU with a small p, not protectionism because they want to reverse the clock, but they just don't want things to move quite as smoothly going forward, and they're trying to protect at least some of their domestic market. So that could be bad news for a country like the UK that is genuinely more inclined towards services. I think the other area where we need to be very careful is the whole area of the democratic deficit, as it's sometimes become known, which is the extent to which some of the supranational institutions, whether it's the Council, whether it's the European Commission, or whether it's qualified majority voting within the Council of Ministers, begins to really impinge on what people perceive their call for greater sovereignty, or at least to be able to control elements that are not impinging on the four freedoms, on the main freedoms. And so I think these are the big issues. Actually, there's a piece I'm writing at the moment which is around this, because I think some people derided the red card that David Cameron negotiated, partly because it's unlikely to kick in earlier the qualified majority voting. But actually, I wonder whether this might create more of a debate within Europe around the limits to qualified majority voting, where there are still substantive national interests which have to be protected. So if I had to point the area where there'd like to be tensions with the EU, those are likely to be ones. Some people point to the Eurozone, but to be honest, I don't think that's a big area. I mean, again, some of the negotiations before the referendum have made it very clear that we will not be pulled in except where it affects our national interests. For instance, we helped the bank bailout in Ireland because it was in our national interest to do so. It would have paid us to do it, even if we'd been outside the EU, frankly. So, but those are the areas of greatest risk, frankly.
All right. Well, Ronald, I think one of the arguments which is advanced by the Brexiteers is that we've become very closely connected with a European economy which is by and large pretty stagnant and indeed is in recession in parts. And although we're not part of the Eurozone, again, because of this close connection to the EU in general, the euro remains a currency which is under great pressure and is not yet can be regarded as a something stable which is going to endure for the future. Therefore, actually, because of these, we'd be better trying to distance ourselves a bit from the European zone and broadening our economic connections out into the rest of the world.
Yeah, I take the point. I mean, if you look at the biggest blips and the biggest positive blips in terms of the UK and the EU, they came about when we joined the EU, and they came about when the single market was formed, and they've kind of leveled off since then. And of course, you're absolutely right with the financial crisis and what I can only call the ill-thought-through creation of the euro. That has created big problems in Europe. But the big problem in Europe is really Germany. It comes back to what we're saying about surpluses and deficits and current account positions. They as a country are just saving too much, and that is something which needs to be addressed, because the counterpart of our deficit and other deficits is, of course, their massive surplus. So I think there are real issues there in Europe, and if these issues are not addressed, then it will impinge, obviously, on our growth, our own balance of payments position. So that said, I don't see there's anything particular about being part of the euro area, even if the euro were to go belly up, that would lead us to, would make us any better off by by diverting our trade away from Europe. I think that would be my position. But having said that, yeah, I mean, if Germany doesn't address its massive surplus, then there will be continuing pressure on the euro, and that certainly will have spillover effects onto our economy. But to be honest, I don't see us being able to avoid that, whatever we do. You know, if we do try and divert our trade elsewhere, if there is another financial crisis in Europe, it will inevitably impinge on us. Yeah.
Just on that point, I mean, I think the counter to that point is, and as both Ronnie and Charles have pointed out, EU deals with third countries are already spanning quite a lot of our trade. If we want to divert our trade towards higher growth areas, why are we not doing it already? Why are we most likely to do it by stepping back from the EU? And it does beg the question of why this hasn't happened already.
Yeah, I think that, and the pithy way of saying it is just because the EU is not a single currency area doesn't mean you say we should withdraw from the EU. Two wrongs don't make a right. I think I think it's right that the euro area just is still facing something of an existential crisis. I mean, the juxtaposition of Germany and Greece is just so stark and so unresolved, even after, 3 years of this? I mean, you either bail Greece out, wages and prices change, or Greece withdraws and has its own currency. And because this is one of the things of the renegotiation, I don't think there was much of substance, actually, in the David Cameron's renegotiation. Some things were probably useful to have in writing, but one of the things he was probably quite good to push was just the increasing recognition that the EU can be a multi-currency area. That's quite an important thing, because it doesn't look like the fiscal union that you need to underpin the currency is coming anytime soon in Europe. You know, the Northern Europeans don't trust the Southern Europeans enough to go anywhere near fiscal union. And given that, I think the currency is always going to look vulnerable because they just don't have the mechanisms to adjust. And incidentally, here in the UK, we're doing this massive fiscal devolution that's about to happen. We're doing, not to the same extent, we're doing something similar. We're having potentially separate fiscal policies with a single currency. And you know, we should keep an eye on that. But to go back to the euro area,
the reality about the single currency is that the US of A has had a single currency for a very long time, has had very different economies in different states, but the balancing mechanism which makes it work is freedom of movement. That, you know, when the Rust Belt industries collapse, people have migrated out of Detroit, Cleveland, and so on to other areas of greater economic activities.
True, they have much higher labour mobility, and they do have federal government. They still have a federal government that can, in extremis, bail out Chrysler and GM, right?
But the main economic adjustment is, in fact, free movement, really, isn't it?
The main ongoing, yes, yeah. America can still deal with crises. The long-term adjustment is through labour mobility. Short-term adjustment is through crisis management, federal government. That's what the US can do. That's what Europe can't do.
Can I make one other point? I mean, some people, and I think it's really interesting how the euro might resolve itself. Some people are now looking at what might be the alternative to fiscal union as a market-based adjustment mechanism. And quite a good report came out recently by a number of researchers, Giancarlo Corsetti, Lucrezia Reichel, and a number of others, saying, okay, let's suppose there won't be a fiscal union for the reason that Charles is outlined. What might be the alternative to that within the existing governance arrangements of the EU? So there's some really interesting discussions there. But, you know, as I say, I think leaving the EU because of the Eurozone crisis is akin to stepping outside a room when there's a nuclear device. You're not going to save yourself by stepping just outside.
Okay, then. Ronald, a brief final comment, and then we'll have to draw things to a close.
On that particular topic, or?
Just on any particular thing.
Well, I just follow up on the latter topic. The reason I think the euro crisis is so bad is a combination of they didn't have fiscal transfers because they didn't have a fiscal union. and they didn't have the labour, capital labour mobility that you referred to. So without either of these, it's going to be a mess, and they've got to address one or t'other if it's going to move forward. And if they don't, then I think they're going to have to relinquish that project.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm afraid I've slightly overrun the time allowed for questions, so I'm going to have to draw things to a close and to invite Muir Russell to deliver some concluding remarks.
And these will, I promise you, be brief. I mean, I'm here because I was involved in the little group that got together this and the other events. We wanted to enlighten the European debate, by which we meant helping to clarify the issues, the things that the media ought to be picking up, the things that people ought to be asking the protagonists and testing them on. And I think that tonight's panel have helped us to do that to a great extent, both sides of the debate, and lots of points to take away. And I hope that those who can help spread the debate out will have been listening to that. So thanks, first and foremost, to Peter for chairing it, and to Anton and Charles and Ronnie for the contributions that they've made. And no closing remarks on behalf of the Royal Society would be complete without a commercial. I think we've given you a little handout like this. I hope you all have it, which should bring you up to date with the rest of the events in the series. The first one is in Inverness, which is one of a series that started with our inaugural event here in February. And it's about a panel of experts discussing some of the key issues and, of course, relevant to the location as well as more generally. The next one is on the 1st of June, and that is about living and working in Europe, about employment regulation, about labour mobility, competitiveness, migration, social policy and welfare, which are, in a sense, the other side of the coin of the issues that we've been hearing about today. And we've got David Bell, Bob Elliott and Richard Brodie and one or two others speaking on that. Take note, please, that that will be in Edinburgh. I think the initial publicity had it that it would be in Glasgow, but for a variety of reasons, it will be in Edinburgh. And I hope that a lot of you who are a very loyal Edinburgh audience can come to that. So put this in your diaries, if you will, and come along on the 1st of June. And then the third of the events is on the 7th of June, and it's here as well, and it's about constitutional implications, disentangling the legal arrangements that would be involved in staying and leaving and human rights and so on. And Ian Walker and Michael Keating and Charlie Jeffrey are those who've been contributing to that, and they're very much at the heart of that ESRC exercise, the UK in a Changing Europe work that's mentioned there. All of this will be on the website, and we hope that the media will pick up some of what's been said tonight and on some of these other occasions as well to help inform that debate. And we will have one or two papers on the website that we won't be able to fit in, because you can see that we were squeezed between the Scottish election and Mr. Cameron's quite early referendum in June, and we had to get as many events in as we can. We can't get them all, but there's a bit more written material that we will give you. And finally, welcome words, finally, we will be sending you an email, all of you who've given us addresses, to give us a little bit of evaluation on the event and on what we do. So with all that, thanks for being here, and we will hope to see you again. I've said 3 things, but at least 2 of them are in Edinburgh, so do come. Thank you.